all the time, and for ag students to appreciate the diversity of agriculture and the dimensions of agriculture. Remember that pyramid in your the strategic plan, all right? So Dr. Ottea received his BS in entomology before I did. His MS in entomology is before my master's was, just a few years. He received his PhD from the University of California, Davis, which is, about 45 minutes from where I grew up. He specializes in insecticide toxicology. He teaches, along with Dr. Stout, this fantastic class, Ag 1005, Science and Society, and I'm working on a press release about that. In graduate level classes in entomology, also teaches insect biology. Dr. Stout, back to this 1, 2, or 2 degree separation thing, grew up near where I grew up and near where my sister, not very near where my sister now lives. So he's from Sacramento, California. And so he went to what we call Cal, which is Berkeley, which intimidated me because there was too many naked people walking around and too much pot being smoked, so I didn't go there. But he has his PhD. The naked guy, is he still walking around there?
He wasn't there when I was there.
Oh, I'm too old then. He also got his PhD from the same university Dr. Ottea did, which is UC Davis.
But a few years after Dr. Ottea.
Oh, you had to point that out, didn't you? He's been here at the Ag Center since 1997. He's responsible for research on plant-insect interactions and pest management in rice. He teaches graduate level courses on plant-insect interactions and in Ag 1005, the class I was just telling you about. They're here today to debate GMOs. And Jesse Neal, one of our ARC alums and LVs, is going to moderate the debate. So you were going to start with the introduction?
Yeah. Okay. That's me. All right. So Dr. Ottea and I thought that we're going to be debating about genetically modified plants, or transgenic plants is another word that's, or another phrase that you sometimes hear. So we thought that some of you might need a little bit of background about genetically modified plants. Let me just get a sense here. How many of you have heard of either genetically modified organisms, genetically modified plants, transgenic plants? So just by a show of hands. Okay, good. So it looks like the majority of you have. And I apologize if some of what I'm saying repeats what you already know or is a little too basic for you. But let me just give you a little bit of background. So you've probably heard the word phenotype before. You know that the phenotype of an organism is its observable or quantifiable characteristic, things like height or weight or hair color or even blood type. So that's a phenotype. And you probably also know that the phenotype of an organism is determined in a pretty complex way by the genes that an organism has, as well as the interaction of those genes with the environment of the organism. So we talk about a phenotype being defined by genes and gene-environment interactions. And I think you probably also know that genes are the basic unit of heredity, and that genes are composed or made of DNA, and that genes carry information that allow an organism to make proteins. And just a rough rule, although it's not really strictly true, but one gene corresponds to one protein. Humans have about 25,000 genes in your what's called your genome, your collection of genetic information, so about 25,000. A rice plant, by comparison, has about 37,000 genes in its genome. So what we're going to be talking about today are techniques, or involve techniques, that allow the insertion of specific genes into the genomes of an organism, either a plant or an animal. Now, when you insert a new gene into an organism, into a plant or an animal, the rules that guide the expression of genes are pretty much the same in every organism. So when you insert a gene into a plant or an animal, that plant or animal will express that gene as if it were one of its own, and so the organism will express a new protein. And a plant or an animal with a gene inserted into it is called a genetically modified plant, genetically modified animal. If the gene comes from an unrelated species, we call it a transgenic plant or a transgenic animal. Now, you may or may not be aware, I think most of you are aware, that there are genetically modified plants that are commonly grown in the United States and across the world. And so far, the most widely grown genetically modified organisms are genetically modified crop plants. And in particular, in the United States, the biggest genetically modified crop plants are corn, cotton, and soybeans. And so far, to this point, to this date, there are really two what are called traits that have been engineered into soybean, cotton, and corn. The two traits that are most common and that are most commonly expressed are, the first one is what's called herbicide tolerance. It's a gene that's been inserted into these plants that makes the plants resistant to herbicides. The most common one is Roundup. And you know Roundup is an herbicide that pretty much kills all plants. Well, if you insert a gene for Roundup tolerance, what you can do is you can spray Roundup over your crop plant, and the Roundup will kill the weeds, but it won't kill the crop plant. And it makes weed control in crop plants a lot easier and a lot more efficient for farmers. So that's the first most widely grown trait is herbicide tolerance. The second most widely grown trait is insect resistance. There are crop plants that have had a gene inserted from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, and this protein, this gene, codes a protein that is toxic to insects. So when this gene is inserted into a crop plant, the cells of the plant express the protein. The protein is toxic to insects, so when the insect feeds on the plant tissue, it dies. So it's the plant itself has been made to carry an insecticidal gene. So two most common genetically modified organisms grown today are BT, cotton, corn, etc., and herbicide tolerant cotton, corn, soybean. And I think that's all of it. Did I miss anything, or is that all the background that we need?
That's what we're going to focus on. That's the part of the technology that we're going to focus on. But just so you know, it extends much further than engineering crop plants and producing more crops. They're engineering salmon that they're putting antifreeze in fish to where you can go catfish up in Canada, and they're the first example, actually the first commercial application of this technology was to move a human gene into bacteria. So it's going kind of the other way, where they took the gene for insulin and they put it into bacteria. And so now most of the insulin that diabetics, type 1 diabetics, buy has been produced in a genetically modified bacteria that has the gene for human insulin. And it's a new world.
So does anybody have any questions? You think you have enough background information to listen to a debate?
The key principle is that genes produce proteins, and so if you have a protein of interest that you want to get produced in whatever, you find the gene and then transfer the gene into whatever it is that you want to produce, whether it's a bacteria that's going to produce insulin, or a plant that's going to produce an insecticidal toxin. You just move the gene from one species into whatever species you want to produce the protein. And as long as it's a protein, it has a gene, and that gene can then be transplanted into pretty much anywhere.
Okay, any questions? So who's going to be moderating this debate?
Jesse.
Okay.
So how much time do we give her for the first part?
6 minutes.
6 minutes.
So Dr. Ottea is going to be taking the pro position, and I'll be taking the con position, and then so 6 minutes each, and then we'll have...
Yeah, and then we'll switch. You have 6 minutes, and then 4 minutes each for rebuttal, and then 2 minutes for response, and then 2 minutes for your position summary.
Now, does he do the first rebuttal, or do I?
You'll always be first.
Okay. Okay. Okay, well, my position is that genetically modified organisms have the potential to reduce hunger, prevent disease, and eliminate environmental contamination that's associated with agriculture as we do it now. There are certainly risks associated with this technology, and I believe that we need to study those risks. But I I believe that our ability to genetically modify plants represents one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of our time, and we should use it. That use of it should be embraced and facilitated. It's a timely technology. Our planet Earth's getting crowded. We just crossed over 7 billion people in November. They're talking about 10 billion people by 2050. That's more mouths to feed. Increased food productivity is going to be required to feed those people. But as the population increases, another thing happens, and that's land that's available to grow, to do agriculture on, actually decreases. And so we need not just crops that with higher yields, but we need to open up some of that non-arable land into land that we can grow crops on. And this the technology associated with genetically modifying plants promises to do both. So genetically modified plants increase agricultural efficiency. Mike talked about plants expressing these insecticidal toxins. What you have in those situations are plants that are resistant to insect feeding. Insects feed on crop plants, and they can take anywhere from 30 to 80% of the yield in that field. With this insecticide being expressed, the insect feeds on the plant and it dies. So you increase the yield, you increase the productivity of that field by genetically modifying plants to produce these insecticides. Not only can plants be modified to produce more food, but plants can also be altered to grow in environments where they can't currently grow. So there's plants now, through the introduction of transgenes that resist cold, drought, heat, that can be grown in situations where the salinity in the soil is very high. And so land that wasn't arable initially can be planted in crops that have these genetic modifications that allow them to grow and survive. But the promise of genetically modified plants is not just in agricultural productivity or increased agricultural efficiency. Genetically modified plants can also reduce disease, and plants have been engineered to produce nutrients that enhance human health. And a good example of this is what's called golden rice. This is a rice strain that's been engineered to produce copious amounts of a compound called beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is a precursor to vitamin A. Vitamin A deficiencies worldwide kill between 250 and 500,000 people a year, most of them children. And so with this golden rice, it's loaded up with this precursor of vitamin A that is deficient in those children's diet. They eat what is a staple of their diet. It contains this vitamin and disease is prevented. We already have that technology. Golden rice is a current plant. The next generation of genetically modified plants will express edible vaccines. So in places over the globe where distribution of conventional vaccines is difficult, places that are difficult to get to or that don't have refrigeration where vaccines can't be stored, you can grow plants that actually express vaccines that prevent human diseases. And rather than getting a conventional vaccination, people just eat a plant that has the vaccine in it and they get immunized that way. Well, and then finally, the use of genetically modified plants reduces environmental contamination that's associated with agriculture as we do it currently. This first generation of genetically modified plants, as Mike discussed, express these insecticidal toxins. So they're insecticides, but they're different insecticides than the ones that we're currently using. They're also applied differently than conventional insecticides. So conventional insecticides are nerve poisons by and large. They attack the nervous system of the insect. They kill non-selectively because of that target site. So insects as well as birds and mammals, there's effects in humans associated with insecticides. They kill pest insects as well as beneficials. Conventional insecticides are applied in such a way through a boom at the back of a tractor or at the back of a crop duster, such that they're sprayed onto the field, but much of the insecticide, maybe most of the insecticide that's sprayed never hits those target plants. It drifts off the field into non-agricultural ecosystems where other non-target organisms are affected. Genetically modified plants expressing insecticides don't suffer from that. The first thing is that the insecticides are different. They're not nerve poisons. They're proteins isolated from bacteria in the case of BT crops that have very, very low mammalian toxicity, or at least acute toxicity. The other thing is that the way that they are expressed in the plant, they're not sprayed, they're actually produced in the plant. such that they're only in the plant. As the plant grows, it produces insecticide within the plant. What this means is there's no drift, or there's minimal amounts of drift out of the agricultural field into the neighboring ecosystem. So non-targets in those neighboring ecosystems are not exposed to the insecticide. So it's a much more ecologically friendly way to apply insecticides. And they kill insects that eat the plant. They don't kill insects, beneficial insects that are eating insects that eat the plant. They're only toxic. They're only, the only insects that are exposed are the target insects, the insects that are eating on your plant. That's my 6 minutes.
Wow.
Okay,
Wow. So you're actually timing this.
I'm timing.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna have to talk fast. Okay, tell me when to start.
Okay, you can start.
Okay, great. That'll make me nervous. All right. So, as Dr. Ottea said, there's certainly a need for increased agricultural production, and it really is one of the most important problems facing mankind over the next 50 years. Unfortunately, my position is that unfortunately the use of genetically modified plants represents only a short-term and not a long-term and sustainable solution to our food problem. This is because the use of genetically modified plants embodies or involves the same approach to farming and pest management that has over the last 60 years proven to be unstable and insufficient. So what we need is, instead of genetically modified plants, we need an entirely new approach to farming and to pest management, not a mere recasting of the same old approach. So that's my opening statement. Now let me begin my argument by saying a few things, making a few points about our need for food. As Dr. Ottea said, we do have a food problem. There's a need for increased agricultural production, and by 2050, global production, the global population will increase by 2 to 3 billion people, which, along with changes in patterns of food use and so on, we're probably going to need about 2 times the amount of food in about 50 years. But increasing agricultural production is really only one dimension of the problem. We also need to increase the stability in our food supply, and at the same time, we need to maintain we need to reduce the environmental impact of farming and pest management, because without healthy ecosystems, farming and plant protection is not sustainable. So representing our food problem as merely a need for increased agricultural production, doesn't really encapsulate the full problem. Now, genetically modified plants, as I said, do not represent a fundamentally new approach to farming and to pest management. Now let me explain, because it seems like genetically modified plants are an entirely different approach, but in reality, it's really the same kind of approach we've been using for the past 60 years. The past 60 years has seen the widespread adoption of what you might call a therapeutic approach to pest management. And by therapeutic approach, what I mean is we attempt to treat pest problems the same way that we treat diseases in humans, and that is by throwing a drug at it after the problem has developed. Pest problems and human diseases also are inherently complex phenomena, but our solution has been a very crude silver bullet type approach, trying to throw a single tactic or a single drug at the problem and hoping that solves it. So in that sense, genetically modified plants represented just a continuation of the way that we've been treating pest problems over the past 60 years. A single tactic approach that attempts to solve a problem rather than prevent the problem, and rather than taking a multi-pronged or a multi-tactic approach to solving pest problems. So genetically modified plants really is just the same old approach to pest management that we've engaged in for the past 60 years. And because that's the case, because it's the same old approach, it has the same old problems. And so let me detail some of the problems with our current approach to pest management. Number one, it's inherently unstable. It's unstable because pests have a habit of developing resistance to whatever tactic you throw at them. So if you're relying on a single tactic, a silver bullet type approach, the pest, be it a weed or an insect, will eventually, and usually sooner rather than later, develop resistance to that tactic. And so that's the case with insecticides, that insects develop resistance to it. And it's also the case with Bt plants. Insects are already developing resistance to the Bt genes that we're inserting into plants. So inherently unstable. Once they develop resistance, you have to develop a new plant with a new toxin, and it's what's called a pesticide treadmill. So over and over, you throw the tactic at the plant, at the insect develops resistance, and then you have to throw a new protein at it. Environmental contamination is another problem. Now, Dr. Ottea said that Bt plants, I don't know if he said they didn't contaminate the environment, at least he said they weren't as contaminating, and that's probably true. But to say that Bt plants or herbicide tolerant plants aren't environmentally contaminating is simply not true. And I'll give you a few examples of contamination. Number one, pollen or tissues from Bt genetically modified plants can be toxic to non-target organisms. Number two, gene products, the proteins from genetically modified plants can leach into water and go places where follow the waterways and so on, and end up places that you didn't want them. In fact, that's already happening with Bt corn in the Midwest. We're finding Bt proteins in places that we didn't want them. And then the biggest risk with genetically modified plants has to do with outcrossing. The pollen from genetically modified plants carries the foreign gene, the gene that's been inserted. And so if that pollen goes and fertilizes a different variety of the same plant or a related plant, that gene has escaped into plants, and indeed this is happening. It happened in Louisiana in rice. We had a gene for herbicide tolerance that escaped from the variety in which it was developed into a variety that wasn't supposed to have it, and it caused a big problem. That's the biggest risk of environmental contamination with genetically modified plants. Health effects. We all know that pesticides can have, oh geez, we all know that pesticides can have big, all right, I'll get to the rest later.
4 minutes.
4 minutes is up.
Mike's problem with GMOs appear to be more a problem with the approach than the technology itself, and much of that I can agree with. But to say that this technology, that there's a problem with this technology because it's a part of a misguided approach, what's the option, or the alternative to that is to spray conventional insecticides until we come up with a better approach. And I would argue that that's not a viable option, that we're much better off while we're relying, or if we have an approach that relies on insecticides, it might as well be insecticides that are expressed in genetically modified plants rather than biocides that are being sprayed out of the back of airplanes. So in the meantime, I would agree that we need a new approach, but in the meantime, while we're building, and we've been saying that since we've been spraying insecticides, and basically we have the same approach that we did post-World War II. So in the meantime, while we're working on that new approach, I would advocate the use of genetically modified, or insecticides that are produced in genetically modified organisms. As far as environmental contamination, there was one study showing that pollen from cornfields, corn that was genetically modified, was toxic to monarch butterflies, and the way that was done was not to feed monarchs in fields of genetically modified organisms, but to spray pollen or sprinkle pollen on the monarch's food, and sure enough there was enough insecticide in the pollen to kill the monarchs. And so the take-home message could be that potentially concentrations of Bt, or that a non-target organism could eat enough pollen and get enough Bt to be killed by it. And that's not surprising. But when there was a follow-up study that actually looked at how much pollen monarchs got when they visited, or if they visited corn that had been genetically modified, and it wasn't enough to kill them. As far as outcrossing, something to be realized about this technology is that the technology is different, but the goal is the same as we've been practicing since we've been domesticating crops. We've been doing plant breeding, we've been improving, we've been mutating, we've been introducing genes into new plants and then selecting for traits that we want, that we consider advantageous for hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years. plants that grow to certain heights, or corn that tastes sweeter than others, or apple varieties that have traits that we consider beneficial. The technology is what's different here. And so this business of outcrossing, pollen from modified plants escaping into the wild, is possible, but it's possible, and the example that Mike gave shows that it actually does happen. But it's no less likely than in systems where plants have been bred through conventional, using non-genetic methods for whatever trait was of interest. That's all I have to say.
Can I have your extra minutes?
No.
30 seconds. Just 30 seconds.
Okay. Actually, I don't know if I'm gonna. All right. So Dr. Ottea has argued that genetically modified plants represent an improvement over the approach that has dominated for the last 50 years, which is heavy reliance on broad-spectrum pesticides. And I'll concede that point, but I'll also make a different point if I can find my notes. I'll also make the point that this new emphasis on genetically modified plants is actually, although it is an improvement over the pesticide-intensive approach that has dominated over the past 60 years, it is, right now, it's dominant. The new approach of using genetically modified plants is dominating the science of pest management, and is really representing a distraction from coming up with a different approach, a more ecologically sustainable approach. So if you work in this area like I do and like Dr. Ottea does, you realize that an incredible amount of resources are being put into this approach of developing genetically modified plants. And the resources that are being put into that approach are actually diverting resources from finding a better way, a more sustainable way, a more ecologically rational way. And as subpoints to that, I would say because genetically modified plants are diverting resources and diverting attention from our true long-term sustainable solutions, we're really not putting the resources into finding those real solutions. And indeed, if we just put our resources and attention on solving some other areas, we make far more progress than has been made with genetically modified plants. In other words, we can solve a lot of the world's problems just using the technology that we have. For example, just by addressing inefficiencies in the use of water and fertilizer, those are really the most important barriers to increase food production. Looking at or taking a closer look at political barriers and market inefficiencies which prevent food from getting from where it's produced to where it's needed is another area that we could solve now, but we aren't. Another is talking about lifestyle changes, things like looking at population growth or stemming population growth or changing the eating patterns. Those are areas that would significantly impact our food problem. But all of these areas, things that we know will work, are not getting the resources and the attention that they need because all those resources and attention are going towards genetically modified plants as the new approach. And as I said, it's not really a new approach. It's ultimately an unsustainable and unstable approach because of some of the things that I said, the development of resistance, the environmental contamination, and so on. I think that's about all I want to say.
Let's just do one more round.
One more round, okay.
About 2 minutes.
A round of rebuttal or a closing?
Closing.
You got more?
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll just wrap up by saying that, to reiterate that GM technology holds great promise, that we can cure disease, reduce hunger, and eliminate environmental contamination by implementing it. I would argue that despite the shortcomings of our current system, I really think this is the way we've been doing it for 60 years. It's going to require the system to fail before we really start looking seriously at other ways, multidisciplinary approaches that Dr. Stout advocates. And I'm not so much for agriculture failing. I think as long as we've got a system that works, that's what growers are going to use. Much of the reason, so there's all this promise, there's also promise of plants that require less fertilizer because they can fix their own nitrogen. There's genetic modification in plants that allow that to happen. Much of the reason that this promise hadn't been fully realized in the present moment is not technological. We've had the technology to do this. Some of these plants are just sitting and waiting to be planted, but it's been political. We've got the technology to treat, prevent disease, and increase agricultural output, and I think we should use it. To use it, we need to reinvent the regulatory environment that is really retarding efforts to bring this technology into the field. And much of our hesitance and much of the reason for that regulatory environment is fear-based. Fears about this technology that will never be quelled regardless of how many long-term studies there are. I mean, we can study this to death and people will still have perhaps somewhat rational fears about potential uses or potential outcomes, negative outcomes of using the technology. And again, I would say that caution is certainly prudent, that these things need to be studied and restudied, but at the current time, being overly cautious is costing human lives. So I think it's time for this technology to flourish.
Okay, this is, so these are concluding remarks, is that what it is? Okay. So, I hope that I've at least made the point that use of this newfound focus on genetically modified plants is really a reliance on the same old failed approach, albeit with fancier tools, sophisticated genetic tools, rather than the old sort of the older tools, the more prosaic pesticides. And relying on the same failed approach cannot really solve our problem because of the inherent instability and contamination that's involved with this old approach, relying on single tactics and so on. So we clearly need a new approach, an approach to agriculture, to farming, to pest management that relies on understanding complex ecological systems and using the attributes of those systems to prevent pest problems before they occur, and then when they do occur, using a multi-pronged or multi-tactic approach to treating problems. Unfortunately, the current emphasis on genetically modified plants has diverted resources away from finding those more sustainable, more difficult solutions to pest problems. And so I would argue that although, yes, genetically modified plants do represent an improvement over use of broad-spectrum pesticides, still the focus on those has diverted resources away from where we really need to be putting our attention, and that's understanding agroecosystems as complex ecological systems and looking at prevention and holistic approaches to treatment. And moreover, the focus on genetically modified plants is diverting attention away from those areas where we certainly do know some of the answers, and if we just put more resources into those answers, we could solve many of the food problems that we have, and those are things like getting market inefficiencies and inefficiencies in getting food from where it's produced to where it's needed.